In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, a sculptor vanishes from his studio, leaving behind an unfinished statue and a trail of secrets. Was it the ambitious apprentice, the prideful patron, the venomous critic, or the charming dealer who orchestrated his disappearance? As whispers of greed and betrayal swirl, only Miss Jane Marple's keen eye can unravel a sinister plot to forge a legacy for profit. In a web of clues red clay, a midnight note, and a hidden signature every step pulls you deeper into a classic Agatha Christie mystery where no one is what they seem. Chapter 1. The Empty Studio. The morning mist clung to the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead, softening the outlines of the village's thatched cottages and lending an air of quiet mystery to the lanes. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her chintz parlour, was engrossed in her knitting, the soft click of needles punctuating the stillness. Her eyes, bright and bird-like, flickered occasionally to the window, where the world beyond seemed to hum with its usual rhythm until it didn't. A sharp rap at the door startled her, and she set aside her wool as Dr. Haydock, the village physician, burst in, his face flushed with urgency. "Miss Marple, you must come at once," he exclaimed, his usually steady voice tinged with agitation. "It's Vanholt, the sculptor. He's vanished from his studio, and no one knows where." Miss Marple's delicate brows lifted, though her composure remained unshaken. "Vanished, you say? Most intriguing. Let me fetch my shawl." With a practiced grace, she rose, her mind already turning over possibilities as a gardener might turn soil. Disappearances, she knew, were rarely as simple as they seemed. The sculptor's studio, a weathered barn perched on the village's edge where the meadow met the wood, was a place Miss Marple had passed often but never entered. As she and Dr. Haydock approached, the morning sun pierced the mist, illuminating the barn's sagging timbers and the wild roses that clung to its walls. Inside, the air was cool and heavy with the scent of stone dust and linseed oil. The scene that greeted them was one of peculiar disorder. Chisels and mallets lay strewn across a workbench, as if abandoned mid-stroke. A canvas tarp had slipped to the floor, revealing an unfinished marble statue at the room's heart, a woman's form, her features half-carved, emerging from the stone with an almost ghostly presence. Miss Marple stepped carefully, her sensible shoes avoiding a scattering of marble chips. Her gaze darted about, noting details that others might overlook. A chipped teacup, its contents cold and untouched. A woolen scarf draped over a stool, but no sign of Vanholt's heavy coat, which Dr. Haydock swore the man wore daily, even in summer. A sketchbook lay open, its pages filled with bold, confident lines, yet one corner was torn, as if a page had been hastily removed. "Most curious," Miss Marple murmured, her voice soft but laced with purpose. "A man does not abandon his tools, his tea, and his life's work without reason. Something or someone compelled him to leave." Dr. Haydock, pacing near the statue, ran a hand through his greying hair. "It's baffling, Miss Marple. Vanholt was eccentric, yes, but devoted to his craft. He lived for this statue. Clara, his apprentice, found the place like this at dawn. She's beside herself." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly at the mention of Clara. She knew the girl by sight, a slight, pale young woman with a habit of clutching her sketchbook as if it were a shield. "And what does Clara say?" she asked, her tone deceptively mild. "She swears she left him here last evening, working late as usual," Dr. Haydock replied. "She went home to her aunt's cottage and returned this morning to find this." He gestured at the chaos. "Inspector Craddock's bin, called He'll want to speak to everyone, no doubt. Miss Marple nodded, her mind already sifting through the village's web of connections. Vanholt, a Dutch sculptor who had settled in St. Mary Mead 2 years prior, was a figure of fascination and whispers. His talent was undeniable, his sculptures, fetching high prices in London galleries, but his aloof manner had won him few friends. She recalled Mrs. Bantry's gossip at the church bazaar. Vanholt's patron, Sir Reginald Poole, was said to be a tyrant with his purse strings, while sharp-tongued critic, Miss Evelyn Trent, had recently arrived in the village, her pen poised to skewer reputations. Then there was the art dealer, Mr. Felix Drayton, whose sleek car and silk cravats had turned heads at the village fete. An artist's life is never dull, Miss Marple remarked, her eyes lingering on the statue. Its unfinished state seemed to whisper of interruption, of a story cut short. She bent closer, noting the precision of the chisel marks, the care in each curve. This was no casual work. Mr. Vanholt was not a man to leave such a piece lightly. Dr. Haydock sighed. "I hope you're right, Miss Marple, but I fear something dreadful has happened." As they stepped outside, the village was stirring. Mrs. Price, the postmistress, hovered nearby, her curiosity thinly veiled as concern. "Is it true, Doctor? Is Mr. Vanholt gone?" Her voice carried, and Miss Marple noted the gathering crowd, farmers, shopkeepers, and the vicar's wife, all drawn by the scent of scandal. "Let us not jump to conclusions," Miss Marple said. Gently, though her mind was far from idle, she thought of a long-ago incident in St. Mary Mead, when a gardener had vanished after a quarrel, only to be found hiding in a neighbour's shed, nursing a grudge. People, she knew, were predictable in their unpredictability. "We shall see what Inspector Craddock uncovers," she added, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. But already she felt the familiar prickle of curiosity, the sense that beneath the surface of this empty studio lay a tangle of motives, secrets, and lies. Chapter 2. The suspects assembled. The sun had climbed high over St. Mary Mead by noon, its rays filtering through the ancient elms that lined the village green, casting dappled shadows on the cobblestones. The news of Mr. Vanholt's disappearance had spread like wildfire, igniting whispers in every corner, from the butcher's shop to the tea-room where the Women's Institute held court. In the village hall, a sturdy building with peeling paint and a faint smell of damp hymeneals, Inspector Craddock had set up his temporary headquarters. The hall's long table, usually reserved for parish meetings, now bore a clutter of notebooks, a thermos of tea, and the inspector's stern expression, Miss Jane Marple, invited to observe as a courtesy to her reputation for unravelling village mysteries, sat in a high-backed chair in the corner, her knitting needles moving with a steady rhythm that belied the sharpness of her gaze. Her presence was unobtrusive, almost invisible to those who did not know her, but her eyes missed nothing. The click of her needles was a quiet counterpoint to the murmurs of the 4 individuals summoned to account for their connection to the missing sculptor, each seated uncomfortably under Craddock's scrutiny. Inspector Craddock, a man in his 40s with a square jaw and a nonsense air, stood at the head of the table, his hands clasped behind his back. He was not one for theatrics, preferring facts to fancies, but he respected Miss Marple's uncanny knack for seeing what others overlooked. "We are here," he began, his voice clipped, "to establish the whereabouts of Mr. Peter last seen in his studio yesterday evening. I expect full cooperation." His eyes swept the room, lingering on each suspect in turn. First was Clara Henshaw, the apprentice, a slight young woman of 20 with a pale face framed by untidy brown curls. She sat hunched, her hands twisting a handkerchief, her eyes darting to the floor as if it might offer escape. Her navy dress was smudged with charcoal, and her fingers bore the telltale stains of an artist's trade. Miss Marple noted the girl's nervous energy, the way her shoulders tensed when Craddock's gaze fell upon her. Clara had been Varnholt's shadow for over a year, learning the secrets of marble and clay, but her demeanour suggested more than simple grief. Next sat Sir Reginald Poole, the patron, a florid man in his late 50s whose tailored suit strained slightly at the waist. His moustache twitched with impatience, and his voice, when he spoke, carried the boom of one accustomed to being obeyed. He was a landowner, a self-proclaimed connoisseur of art, whose wealth had bankrolled Varnholt's studio and whose name adorned plaques in London galleries. Yet his eyes, small and shrewd beneath bushy brows, betrayed a restlessness that Miss Marple found telling. A man of such pride, she thought, does not take kindly to defiance. Across from him was Miss Evelyn Trent, the art critic, a lean woman of indeterminate age with a face as sharp as her pen. Her black dress was severe, her hair pulled into a tight chignon, and her lips pursed in a way that suggested perpetual disapproval. She held a cigarette holder, unlit, which she tapped against the table with calculated precision. Her reviews, published in London's most influential papers, could elevate or destroy an artist's career, and her recent arrival in St. Mary Mead had coincided with a scathing article on Varnholt's overblown style. Miss Marple watched her closely, noting the faint smirk that played at her lips when Clara fidgeted. Finally, there was Mr. Felix Drayton, the art dealer, a man in his 30s whose polished appearance seemed almost too perfect for the rustic village hall. His silk cravat gleamed, his dark hair was slicked back, and his smile was a practiced blend of charm and confidence. He lounged in his chair, one leg crossed over the other, as if the proceedings were a minor inconvenience. Yet Miss Marple caught the flicker of his eyes toward the door, the slight tightening of his jaw when Craddock mentioned Varnholt's name. A man so at ease, she mused, often has the most to hide. Craddock cleared his throat. Let's begin. With you, Miss Henshaw. You were the last to see Mr. Varnholt, I understand. Tell us exactly what happened. Clara's hands stilled, the handkerchief crumpling in her grip. I was in the studio until about 6 o'clock yesterday, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Varnholt was working on the statue, the big one, the lady in marble. He was particular about it. I tidied up, like always, and left him there. He said he'd stay late. That's all I know. Her eyes flicked to Miss Marple, then away as if seeking rescue. Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second. Clara's words were plausible, but the girl's avoidance of eye contact reminded her of a housemaid in St. Mary Mead who, years ago, had lied about a broken vase to protect a sweetheart. And you went straight home? Miss Marple asked gently, her tone that of a kindly aunt. Clara nodded vigorously. To my aunt's cottage, yes. I didn't go anywhere else. Craddock scribbled a note. And you, Sir Reginald, when did you last see Varnholt? Sir Reginald puffed out his chest, his voice filling the room. A week ago, Inspector. I visited the studio to check on his progress. My money funds that place, after all. He was chiseling away, as usual, muttering about artistic vision. I left him to it. Haven't been back since. He folded his arms, daring contradiction. Miss Marple's lips twitched faintly. Sir Reginald's bluster was familiar. She recalled a village squire who boasted of his charity while neglecting his tenants. Pride, she thought, could mask many motives. "And was Mr. Varnholt agreeable to your suggestions?" she asked. Her voice mild. Sir Reginald's face reddened. "He was stubborn, if that's what you mean. Thought he knew better than his patron. But I didn't press the matter." Craddock turned to Miss Trent, who raised an eyebrow as if the question itself were beneath her. "Miss Trent, your recent review of Varnholt's work was critical. When did you last see him?" Miss Trent tapped her cigarette holder, her voice cool and precise. "I saw him 10 days ago at his studio for an interview. His work, frankly, is overrated, sentimental, lacking originality. I told him as much. He took it poorly, but that's hardly my concern. I've been at the inn since, writing." Her eyes met Craddock's with a challenge, as if daring him to probe further. Miss Marple noted the critic's composure, but also the faint tremor in her hand as she gripped the holder. Confidence, she knew, could be a mask. She thought of a schoolteacher who, years ago, had hidden her jealousy behind sharp words, much like Miss Trent's biting reviews. Finally, Yulee, Mr. Drayton leaned forward, his smile unwavering. "And you, Mr. Drayton, your whereabouts?" "In London," Inspector Drayton replied smoothly. "I returned late last night on the 10:15 train. I deal in Varnholt's sculptures. You see, business keeps me busy. I hadn't seen him in weeks." His voice was as polished as his appearance, but Miss Marple caught the slight hesitation before he mentioned the train. Craddock frowned, flipping through his notebook. "We'll verify that. Now, all of you, think carefully. Any detail could be vital." The room fell silent, save for the creak of chairs and the rustle of Clara's handkerchief. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her mind sifting through the testimonies. Clara's nervousness could be youth or guilt. Sir Reginald's temper suggested a man unused to defiance. Miss Trent's venom hinted at deeper motives, and Drayton's charm was too smooth. Like a village swindler she once knew who'd sold counterfeit silver with a smile. As the suspects rose to leave, Miss Marple spoke, her voice soft but clear. "One moment, Inspector. Miss Henshaw, you mentioned tidying up. Did you touch the teacup on the workbench?" Clara blinked, startled. "No, ma'am. It was Mr. Varnholt's. He always had tea while working." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unreadable. The teacup, cold and full, suggested Varnholt had not lingered long after Clara's departure. And the missing coat, had he left willingly, or was it taken to suggest he had? She thought of a local farmer who'd vanished with his best jacket, only to be found in a neighboring town with a new name. People she knew left traces, even when they tried to disappear. Craddock dismissed the suspects, but not before warning them to remain in the village. As they filed out, Miss Marple caught Clara's fleeting glance at Drayton, and Drayton's subtle nod in return. It was a small thing, easily missed, but Miss Marple's memory was long. She recalled a pair of lovers in St. Mary Mead who'd exchanged such glances, hiding an affair that led to theft. Connections, she thought, were the threads of every mystery. "Miss Marple," Craddock said, approaching her, "you're awfully quiet. Any thoughts?" She smiled, folding her knitting. "Only that human nature is a curious thing, Inspector. Everyone has a story, but not all stories are true." As she stepped into the sunlight, the village green was alive with gossip. Mrs. Bantry, bustling over with a tray of scones, whispered, "They say Varnholt ran off with a lover." Miss Marple smiled politely, but her mind was elsewhere, piecing together the puzzle of an empty studio and 4 uneasy faces. Chapter 3. The Unfinished Statue. The afternoon sun slanted through the high windows of Van Holt's studio, casting long shadows across the stone floor and bathing the unfinished marble statue in a golden glow. Miss Jane Marple stood alone in the converted barn, her small figure dwarfed by the towering figure of the half-carved woman, whose emerging form seemed to pulse with silent secrets. The air was still, heavy with the scent of dust and chisels, and the quiet was broken only by the distant trill of a blackbird beyond the open door. Miss Marple, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, moved with deliberate care, her eyes sharp as they roamed the cluttered space. She had persuaded Inspector Craddock to allow her this private visit, citing a need to clarify her thoughts, though in truth, she sought the truth that lingered in the things left behind. The statue dominated the room, its marble surface, smooth in places, rough in others, as if Van Holt had been caught mid-thought, his chisel arrested by some unseen force. The woman's face was only partially defined, a high cheekbone, the suggestion of a brow, but the lines were exquisite, each stroke revealing a master's hand. Miss Marple tilted her head, studying the curve of the figure's shoulder, the delicate hollow where the neck would have been. "A labor of love," she murmured, her voice barely disturbing the silence. "And yet, abandoned. Why?" She stepped closer, her sensible shoes crunching softly on the scattered marble chips. The workbench nearby was a chaos of tools, mallets, chisels, and a small rasp, all lying as if dropped in haste. A tin of linseed oil had tipped over, its contents pooling in a dark stain on the wood. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the teacup, still untouched, its contents now clouded with a faint scum. She noted the absence of fingerprints on its handle, a detail that struck her as peculiar. A man who drinks tea daily, she thought, would leave a mark, unless the cup was placed here by another. Her eyes drifted to the floor, where a faint trail of marble dust led to a corner of the studio. There, beneath a heavy mallet, she spied a scrap of paper, its edge crumpled as if it had been stepped on. She bent with surprising agility for her age, retrieving it with care. The paper was small, torn from a larger sheet, and bore a scrawled message in black ink. "Meet me at the old mill, midnight." No signature, no date, but the handwriting was hurried, the pen pressed hard into the paper. Miss Marple turned it over, noting a faint smudge of charcoal on the back, the kind an artist might leave. She slipped the note into her reticule, her mind already turning to Clara, whose sketchbook she had glimpsed at the village hall, its pages marked with similar charcoal stains. The studio offered other clues, subtle but telling. A wooden stool held a folded cloth, its edges frayed, and beside it lay a pair of gloves, too large for Clara's small hands but well worn, suggesting frequent use by Van Holt. Yet the coat rack by the door was empty, confirming Dr. Haydock's observation that Van Holt's heavy woolen coat was missing. Miss Marple paused, her fingers brushing the rack's empty hook. A cold evening, she mused, and a man leaves without his coat. Or perhaps it was taken to suggest he left willingly. She recalled a long-ago incident in St. Mary Mead, when a missing scarf had led her to uncover a theft disguised as a departure. Objects, she knew, could lie as convincingly as people. She circled the statue once more, her eyes tracing the chisel marks. They were precise, deliberate, not the work of an apprentice still learning her craft. Yet something about the statue's base caught her attention, a faint irregularity in the stone, as if a section had been hastily smoothed over. She knelt, her joints protesting faintly, and peered closer. A tiny scratch, barely visible, marked the marble, shaped like the edge of a chisel slipped in haste. "Not Varnholt's hand," she murmured. "His work is flawless." The scratch suggested another's touch. Perhaps someone inspecting the statue after its master's departure. Rising, Miss Marple turned her attention to a shelf above the workbench, where a row of sketchbooks stood like sentinels. She opened one, its pages filled with Varnholt's bold studies of hands, faces, and flowing drapery. But the final page was missing, its jagged edge matching the scrap in her reticule. Clara's work, perhaps, she thought, recalling the girl's nervous demeanor, or someone else's, left to mislead. She closed the book, her mind sifting through possibilities as a seamstress might sort threads. The studio door creaked, and Mrs. Bantry, ever eager for news, poked her head in. "Miss Marple, I heard you were here. Isn't it dreadful about poor Mr. Varnholt? The village is positively buzzing." Her round face was flushed with excitement, her hat slightly askewed. Miss Marple smiled, her expression mild, but her eyes alert indeed, Mrs. Bantry, but a buzzing village often drowns out the truth. "Tell me, have you heard anything of Clara Henshaw's habits? She seems a devoted apprentice." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened, delighted to be consulted. "Oh, Clara. Quiet as a mouse, always sketching. She worships Varnholt, follows him like a puppy. But I heard from Mrs. Price that she was seen near the old mill last week, carrying a parcel. Odd, don't you think?" Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking in memory as she tucked the tidbit away. "Very odd," she agreed. "And what of Mr. Drayton, the dealer? He seems a man of influence." Mrs. Bantry leaned closer, lowering, her voice sly as a fox. "That one, always smiling, but I don't trust him. He was at the fete last month, charming everyone, but Mrs. Weatherby swears he tried to sell her a fake painting once. And Sir Reginald, well, he's been short-tempered lately, ever since Varnholt refused to sculpt a bust of him." Miss Marple's lips twitched. Mrs. Bantry's gossip, though scattered, was a goldmine of human nature. "And Miss Trent," she prompted, "the critic." "Oh, she's a viper," Mrs. Bantry said with relish. "She was at the inn yesterday, scribbling away. Said Varnholt's work was a fad for fools. Can you imagine?" Miss Marple could imagine quite well. She thanked Mrs. Bantry and sent her on her way, promising to join her for tea later. Alone again, she stood before the statue, her thoughts coalescing. The note, the missing coat, the scratch on the marble oar pointed to a disruption, a plan gone awry. She recalled a village girl, years ago, who had left a note to lure a rival to a barn, only to regret her scheme when it spiraled into chaos. Clara, perhaps, she mused, or someone using her hand. As she left the studio, the sun was dipping toward the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose. The village seemed peaceful, but Miss Marple knew better. Beneath its calm surface lay currents of envy, greed, and ambition, motives that could turn a sculptor's sanctuary into a stage for disappearance. She tightened her shawl, her mind already turning to the old mill and the secrets it might hold. Chapter 4. The patron's pride. The late afternoon light filtered through the leaded windows of Poole Manor, casting intricate patterns on the polished oak floors. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a backed chair in Sir Reginald Poole's grand drawing-room, held a delicate porcelain teacup, its warmth a small comfort against the chill of the cavernous space. The invitation to the manor had come unexpectedly, delivered by Sir Reginald's butler with a flourish that suggested the baronet. was eager to assert his importance in the unfolding mystery of Varnholt's disappearance. Miss Marple, ever courteous, had accepted. Sensing an opportunity to probe beneath the surface of the patron's bluster, the room was a testament to Sir Reginald's wealth and taste, or, rather, his desire to proclaim both. Marble busts lined the walls, their blank eyes staring from mahogany plinths, while a massive chandelier gleamed above, its crystals catching the fading light. At the room's centre stood a bronze nymph, one of Varnholt's early works, its lithe form gleaming with a patina that spoke of both artistry and expense. Sir Reginald, resplendent in a velvet smoking jacket, gestured toward it with a proprietary air. "Varnholt's finest piece, Miss Marple," he boomed, his voice echoing off the panelled walls. "I commissioned it myself. Cost me a pretty penny, but worth every shilling." Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression one of polite admiration. Though her eyes were busy cataloguing details, the nymph's pedestal bore a faint scratch, not unlike the one she had noticed on the unfinished statue in Varnholt's studio. "A remarkable work," she said softly. "Mr. Varnholt must value your support immensely." Sir Reginald's moustache twitched, and he puffed out his chest. "He ought to. Without my backing, he'd be chiseling gravestones in some Dutch hamlet. I gave him the studio, the tools, the marble, everything." His tone carried a note of indignation, as if Varnholt's talent were a personal possession. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her gaze drifting to a portrait above the fireplace. Stern-faced Sir Reginald, painted in oils, his hand resting on a globe as if to claim the world itself. "And yet," she ventured, her voice as gentle as a breeze artists can be, "independent. Did Mr. Varnholt ever resist your guidance?" Sir Reginald's face darkened, his small eyes narrowing. "Resist? The man was impossible," I suggested. "A grand Pisa statue of Victory for the Manor Gardens, perfect for my collection, but he insisted on that wretched half-carved woman, muttering about his vision." "Vision?" He snorted, pacing to the window. "I told him, 'Peter, my money pays for your visions. You'll do as I say.' He didn't take kindly to it." Miss Marple's needles, tucked in her knitting bag, remained still, but her mind was as active as ever. She recalled a village squire, long ago, who had bullied a tenant into selling prized land, only to find the man's stubbornness led to sabotage. Pride, she knew, could breed resentment, and resentment could fester into darker deeds. "A disagreement, then?" she asked, her tone disarming. Sir Reginald hesitated, his fingers drumming on the windowsill. A spat, nothing more. He'd come around, eventually. Always did. But his voice lacked conviction, and Miss Marple noted the way his eyes avoided hers, darting instead to the nymph's gleaming form as the butler refilled her cup. Miss Marple steered the conversation to lighter matters, complimenting the manor's rose garden, but her ears caught a faint murmur from the hallway, a housemaid whispering to the butler about Sir Reginald's debts and that London bank. The words were fleeting, but Miss Marple's memory was a steel trap. She thought of a St. Mary Mead merchant who, burdened by debts, had once staged a robbery to claim insurance. Could Sir Reginald, so proud of his patronage, be desperate enough to act against an artist who defied him? "Tell me, Sir Reginald," she said, setting down her cup, "did you visit the studio recently? Perhaps to discuss this Victory statue?" He turned sharply, his moustache bristling. "I told the inspector a week ago, no more. I've been here, tending to estate matters. Ask my staff." His tone was defensive, and Miss Marple noted the slight flush creeping up his neck. "Of course," she murmured, her smile serene. It's only that a patron's interest is so vital to an artist's work. You must have been eager to see his progress. Sir Reginald grunted, mollified but wary. I was. But Varnholt was secretive, always locking the studio door, muttering about surprises. I didn't press him. He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, though I did see that dealer, Drayton, skulking about the village last week. Shifty fellow, if you ask me. Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her face remained placid. Mr. Drayton, how interesting. He seems a man of ambition. Ambition, Sir Reginald scoffed. Greed, more like. Always sniffing around Varnholt's work, talking of new markets. I wouldn't trust him with a farthing. As the visit drew to a close, Sir Reginald escorted her to the manor's entrance, his manner recovering its pomp. You'll let me know if you hear anything, Miss Marple. I've a stake in this, you know. Varnholt's work is my legacy too. His voice was hearty, but Miss Marple detected a note of unease. Like a crack in a fine vase, she nodded, her shawl drawn tight against the evening chill. Of course, Sir Reginald, a legacy is a precious thing. As she stepped into the waiting car, courtesy from the manor she reflected on the patron's pride. It was a towering thing, as grand as his manor, but towers could crumble when built on shaky ground. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting resumed, the needles clicking in time with her thoughts. Sir Reginald's temper, his debts, his insistence on control, painted a picture of a man whose pride might drive him to extremes. She thought of the scratch on the nymph's pedestal, so like the one on Varnholt's statue. A coincidence, she mused, or a sign of something more deliberate. The village clock chimed, and Miss Marple's mind turned to the other suspects. Clara's nervousness, Miss Trent's venom, Drayton's charm. Each was a thread in the tapestry of Varnholt's disappearance, but Sir Reginald's pride loomed large, a motive as old as human nature itself. She set her knitting aside, her eyes gleaming with quiet resolve. The manor had revealed much, but the truth, she knew, lay in the shadows still to be explored. Chapter 5. The critics venom the rose and crown. St. Mary Mead's Soul Inn was a cosy establishment with low beams and a hearth that glowed warmly against the encroaching dusk. Its taproom, usually a haven for farmers and tradesmen, was this evening unusually quiet, save for the sharp clink of a glass and the measured tones of Miss Evelyn Trent, the art critic, who sat at a corner table with a glass of sherry and a notebook. Miss Jane Marple, having arranged to meet Mrs. Bantry for an early supper, arrived a little early, her keen eyes noting Miss Trent's solitary figure before her friend bustled in. The critic's presence was no coincidence, Miss Marple suspected, for the inn was a hub of village gossip, and Miss Trent's sharp ears were likely tuned to every whisper about Varnholt's disappearance. Miss Marple settled into a cushioned chair near the window, her knitting bag at her side, though she left the needles untouched for now. Her gaze, deceptively mild, lingered on Miss Trent, whose severe black dress and tightly pinned hair gave her the air of a governess from a bygone era. The critic was scribbling in her notebook, her cigarette holder tapping rhythmically against the table, a habit Miss Marple had noted at the village hall. The woman's face, sharp and angular, bore a perpetual frown, as if the world itself failed to meet her exacting standards. Mrs. Bantry arrived, her cheeks flushed from the brisk walk. "Jane, you're early. Oh look, there's that Trent woman. Nasty piece of work, isn't she?" she whispered, settling beside Miss Marple with a rustle of skirts. "I heard she's writing a new piece on Varnholt's, something vicious, no doubt." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes never leaving Miss Trent. A critic's pen can be as sharp as a sculptor's chisel, she remarked. Let us join her, Dolly. A chat might prove illuminating. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened, but she followed as Miss Marple approached Miss Trent's table, her manner as disarming as a summer breeze. Miss Trent, may we join you? The inn is rather quiet tonight, and company is always pleasant. Miss Trent looked up, her lips pursing as if she'd tasted something sour. Miss Marple, isn't it? And Mrs. Bantry, very well. Sit if you must. Her voice was clipped, her tone suggesting she'd rather be alone, but Miss Marple's serene smile was difficult to refuse as they settled. Miss Marple ordered a pot of tea, her hands folded neatly in her lap. You must find St. Mary Mead, a change from London, she began, her voice soft. All this talk of Mr. Varnholt's disappearance must be quite a distraction for your work. Miss Trent's eyes narrowed, her cigarette holder pausing mid. A distraction? Hardly. Varnholt's absence is merely a footnote to his mediocrity. His work is derivative, sentimental claptrap dressed up as art. I told him so when I interviewed him. He had the nerve to argue. She sipped her sherry, her movements precise, but her fingers betraying a slight tremor. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite interest. An artist's pride can be fragile, she said. Your reviews carry such weight, Miss Trent. They must stir strong feelings. Miss Trent's smirk was fleeting but unmistakable. Feelings, artists should be above such things. Varnholt's latest piece, that half-finished woman in his studio, is a perfect example of his flaws. Overwrought, lacking subtlety. I'm writing a review that will make that clear. It'll be published next week, and London will thank me for it. Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest, though her face remained placid. She recalled a St. Mary Mead seamstress who, slighted by a harsh word, had spread malicious gossip to ruin a rival. Words, she knew, could wound as deeply as deeds, and Miss Trent's venom seemed sharpened by more than professional zeal. You visited the studio recently, then? She asked, her tone as innocent as a child's. 10 days ago, Miss Trent replied, her voice cool, for the interview. He was chiseling away, oblivious to reason. I left him to his delusions. She flipped her notebook shut, as if to end the conversation. Mrs. Bantry, unable to resist, leaned forward. But what about that parcel you got, Miss Trent? Mrs. Price at the post office said it was heavy, from London, delivered the day Varnholt vanished. Books, was it? Miss Trent's hand froze, her cigarette holder suspended. For a moment, her composure slipped, revealing a flash of irritation. Books, yes, she snapped. Research materials. Critics do read, Mrs. Bantry, unlike some. Her tone was cutting, but Miss Marple noted the way her eyes darted to the side, a telltale sign of discomfort. Research is so important, Miss Marple said smoothly, pouring tea with deliberate care. Though a heavy parcel might contain more than books, perhaps casts or moulds, for studying an artist's technique. Her voice was gentle, but her words probed like a needle dot. Miss Trent's lips tightened. You're quite the detective, Miss Marple. But I assure you, my work is above suspicion. She rose abruptly, gathering her notebook. If you'll excuse me, I have a deadline. As she swept out, Mrs. Bantry huffed. Rude woman. Did you see how she dodged your question, Jane? I bet that parcel wasn't books at all. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind turning over the encounter. Miss Trent's defensiveness, the tremor in her hand, the heavy parcel suggested a secret, one she guarded fiercely. She thought of a village schoolteacher who had hidden stolen letters in a parcel, claiming they were school supplies. Deceptions, she knew, often hid in plain sight. Later, as they walked back to the village, Miss Marple paused at the post office to chat with Mrs. Price, whose memory for deliveries was as sharp as her tongue. "Oh, that parcel for Miss Trent," Mrs. Price said, her eyes gleaming. Heavy as a sack of potatoes, it was. Came from a London art supply shop, not a bookseller. I saw the label myself. Miss Marple thanked her, her mind alight with possibilities, an art critic with casts. Or molds could be studying Varnholt's work or copying it. And Miss Trent's venom, so freely aimed at the sculptor, might mask a deeper motive, jealousy, perhaps, or a desire to control his legacy. As she returned to her cottage, the evening stars emerging above St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple felt the threads of the mystery tightening, each suspect's story weaving a pattern that was beginning to take shape. Chapter 6. The dealers charm the market town of Much Benham. A short drive from St. Mary Mead bustled with the quiet energy of a late summer morning. Its cobbled streets were lined with shops selling everything from fresh-baked bread to polished antiques, but it was the Drayton Gallery, tucked between a florist and a haberdasher, that drew Miss Jane Marple's attention. Mr. Felix Drayton, the art dealer, had extended an invitation to view his collection, a gesture cloaked in courtesy, but tinged, Miss Marple suspected, with a desire to steer the narrative surrounding Varnholt's disappearance. She had accepted with her usual grace, sensing that the gallery's gleaming surfaces might conceal as much as they revealed. The gallery itself was a study in elegance, its whitewashed walls adorned with paintings and sculptures displayed under carefully angled lights. The air carried the faint scent of polish and old wood, and the soft chime of a bell announced Miss Marple's arrival. Mr. Drayton emerged from a back room, his silk cravat immaculate, his smile as polished as the marble busts lining the shelves. "Miss Marple, what a delight!" he exclaimed, his voice smooth as velvet. "I'm honored to show you my humble collection. Varnholt's work, of course, is the jewel in our crown." Miss Marple inclined her head, her eyes bright beneath the brim of her hat. "You're too kind, Mr. Drayton. I'm merely a curious old lady, but I do admire fine art." Her tone was gentle, almost self-deprecating, but her gaze was sharp. Noting the slight sheen of perspiration on Drayton's brow despite the cool room, he led her through the gallery, gesturing to a series of Varnholt's sculptures, small bronzes of nymphs and satyrs, their forms glowing under the spotlights. "Peter's genius lies in his detail," Drayton said, pausing before a delicate figure of a dancer. "This piece sold for a tidy sum last month. His work is in demand. You know London, Paris, even New York." His enthusiasm seemed genuine, but Miss Marple caught the calculated way he watched her, as if gauging her reaction. "Such success must be rewarding," she remarked, her fingers brushing the edge of her shawl, "though I imagine it requires a keen eye for authenticity." Her voice was mild, but the word hung in the air, and she noted the brief flicker in Drayton's eyes. "Authenticity is my trade, Miss Marple," he replied, his smile unwavering. "Every piece here is verified. Varnholt's signature is unmistakable." He pointed to a faint mark on the dancer's base, a stylized V etched with precision. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze drifting to a crate in the corner, partially obscured by a velvet curtain. Its wooden slats were fresh, unlike the weathered crates she had seen in Varnholt's studio, and a label read Varnholt Originals. She tilted her head, her expression one of innocent curiosity. "New works, Mr. Drayton, from a man who's vanished. Drayton's laugh was a touch too hearty. Oh, those are older pieces, recently acquired from a private collector. Van Holt's output was prolific, you see. He steered her toward another sculpture, but Miss Marple's mind lingered on the crate. Fresh wood suggested recent packing, and a missing artist could not produce new works, or could he, under duress? As they moved through the gallery, charm flowed like a well-rehearsed performance. He spoke of Van Holt's temperament, his artistic quirks, and the challenges of marketing such a reclusive genius. Peter was difficult, he admitted, his tone confiding, but I understood him. Art is my passion, Miss Marple, not just profit. His eyes met hers, earnest and warm, but Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead shopkeeper who had charmed customers while selling tainted goods. Charm, she knew, could be a mask for calculation. Passion is a fine thing, she said, pausing before painting a landscape. Not Van Holt's work, but its frame bore a faint scratch, similar to those on the studio statue and Sir Reginald's nymph, though I imagine the art world can be competitive, rivals, perhaps, critics like Miss Trent. Drayton's smile tightened, just for a moment. Evelyn Trent. She's a vulture, picking at artists' bones. Her reviews hurt sales, but I manage. Van Holt didn't care for her, either. She was at the studio last month, stirring trouble. He waved a hand, dismissing the topic, but Miss Marple noted the edge in his voice, the way his fingers adjusted his CRAVAT dot. As they concluded the tour, Drayton offered her tea, but she demurred, citing a prior engagement. "You've been most generous, Mr. Drayton," she said, her smile warm but her eyes searching. "One last question. Did you ever visit Van Holt's studio at night, to discuss business, perhaps?" His laugh was quick, almost too quick. "At night? No, Miss Marple. My business is done in daylight. Besides, I was in London, as I told the inspector." He escorted her to the door, his manner impeccable, but Miss Marple caught the slight clench of his jaw as he bid her farewell. On the drive back to St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting bag untouched, her mind sifting through the morning's observations, the fresh crate, the scratched frame, Drayton's polished deflection, all pointed to a man who knew more than he revealed. She thought of a village swindler years ago who had sold forged silver with a smile, his charm disarming suspicion until the truth emerged. Drayton's gallery, she suspected, was a stage, and his performance concealed a deeper game. Back at her cottage, she learned from Mrs. Bantry, who had stopped by with a basket of plums, that Drayton had been seen at the station the night of Van Holt's disappearance, his suitcase heavy and his manner hurried. "Mrs. Price swears he looked nervous," Mrs. Bantry said, her eyes gleaming, "and his boots were muddy red mud, not like our local soil." Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. "Red clay, like that found near the old mill." The threads of the mystery were tightening, and Drayton's charm, however dazzling, could not obscure the shadows gathering around him. Chapter 7. The midnight clooth. The moon hung low over St. Mary Mead, its silver light casting long shadows across the meadows that stretched beyond the village. The old mill, a crumbling relic on the outskirts where the river bent sharply, stood silent, its broken wheel half submerged in the sluggish current. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a thick shawl against the night's chill, made her way along the narrow path, her steps cautious but resolute. Inspector Craddock, though sceptical of her insistence on visiting the mill, had reluctantly agreed, provided she was accompanied by young Constable Harris, whose lantern bobbed nervously in the darkness. The note she had found in Studio meet me at the old mill. Midnight had ignited her curiosity, and Miss Marple was not one to let a clue lie dormant. The mill loomed ahead, its timbers sagging under the weight of years, its windows dark and hollow like the eyes of a forgotten guardian. The air carried the damp scent of moss and river water, mingled with a faint acrid tang that Miss Marple could not quite place. "Careful, ma'am," Constable Harris muttered, his voice low as he held the lantern higher. "This place ain't safe at night." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes scanning the ground. "Safety, Constable, is often a matter of seeing what others miss." Her gaze settled on a patch of earth near the mill's entrance, where the soil was disturbed, marked by two distinct sets of footprints, one heavy, with deep treads, the other lighter, more delicate. She knelt, ignoring the damp that seeped through her skirt, and studied the impressions. The heavier prints were broad, suggesting a man's boots, while the lighter ones bore the faint outline of a woman's shoe. "Perhaps Clara's, to visitors," she murmured, and recently. Constable Harris, peering over her shoulder, frowned. "Could be poachers, ma'am, or lovers sneaking about." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone noncommittal, "but lovers rarely carry chisels." She pointed to a glint in the grass, a metal tool, half buried, its blade stained with red clay. She retrieved it carefully, holding it to the lantern's light. It was a sculptor's chisel, identical to those in Varnholt's studio, its handle worn from use. The red clay, however, was foreign to St. Mary Mead's loamy soil, suggesting a journey beyond the village. "Red clay," she mused, slipping the chisel into her reticule. "Not from here, I think. The nearest such clay is near Danbury, some miles away." She recalled a St. Mary Mead gardener who had once hidden stolen tools in a shed, claiming they were borrowed. Clues, she knew, were often left in haste, their significance overlooked by the careless. The mill's door creaked as Constable Harris pushed it open, revealing a cavernous interior strewn with rotting planks and rusted machinery. Miss Marple stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dimness. The lantern's glow revealed a small shed in the corner, its door ajar. She approached, noting a faint scuff mark on the threshold, as if something heavy had been dragged. Inside the shed, the air was musty, and a pile of burlap sacks lay in disarray. Beneath them she spied a scrap of cloth wool, dark and coarse, like Varnholt's missing coat. She lifted it, revealing a faint stain that might have been oil or blood, though the light was too dim to tell. "Constable," she said softly, "this cloth, please, have it examined. It may be important." Harris nodded, his face pale, clearly unnerved by the eerie setting. As they searched further, Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a glimmer beneath a broken crater, single cufflink, silver, engraved with the letter D. She picked it up, turning it over in her gloved fingers. D for Drayton, perhaps, she thought, recalling the dealer's polished appearance and the nervous glance he'd cast at the village hall. She tucked the cufflink away, her mind weaving connections. A cufflink, a chisel, a scrap of clothwool, fragments of a puzzle that pointed to a meeting gone wrong. The return to the village was silent. Constable Harris clutching the lantern as if it were a talisman. Miss Marple, however, was deep in thought, her mind tracing the threads of the mystery. The footprints suggested to people, one possibly Clara, whose note had lured Varnholt to the mill. The chisel and clay hinted at a journey, perhaps to a place where Varnholt was held or hidden. And the cufflink, if it belonged to Drayton, placed him at the scene. Despite his claim of being in London back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting needles resuming their quiet rhythm. She rang the cobbler, Mr. Gresham, a man whose memory for boots rivaled Mrs. Price's for parcels. "Mr. Gresham," she said, her voice warm, "have you repaired any boots with red clay recently? Perhaps for Mr. Drayton?" Gresham's voice crackled through the line. "I, Miss Marple." Drayton brought in a pair the day after Varnholt went missing. Caked with red mud, they were. Said he'd been hiking near Danbury. Odd, for a city man. Miss Marple thanked him, her eyes gleaming. Red clay, a cufflink, a meeting at midnight. The pieces were falling into place, though the picture remained incomplete. She thought of a St. Mary Mead poacher who had left a single feather at a crime scene, betraying his presence. Drayton's charm, she suspected, was a thin veneer over a deeper motive, one tied to the mill and the missing sculptor. As the village clock struck midnight, Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her mind alight with the certainty that the old mill held the key to Varnholt's fate. The night had yielded its clue, and she would follow it, step by careful step, into the shadows. Chapter 8. The Apprentice's Secret. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns on the polished floorboards. She sat in her favourite armchair, a cup of tea cooling beside her, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm. Yet her mind was far from the wool in her hands, occupied instead with the tangled threads of Varnholt's disappearance. The chisel stained with red clay, the cufflink marked with a D, and the cryptic note found in the studio all pointed to a web of deceit. But it was Clara Henshaw, the nervous apprentice, who now held Miss Marple's attention. The girls' trembling hands and evasive glances at the village hall suggested a secret, one that might unravel the mystery if gently coaxed into the light. Miss Marple had arranged to meet Clara at the studio, ostensibly to discuss the unfinished statue, but, in truth, to probe the girl's story. The barn, bathed in morning light, seemed less foreboding than it had under moonlight, though the air still held the dusty scent of marble and oil. Clara was already there, standing before the half-carved woman, her sketchbook clutched tightly to her chest. Her eyes, red-rimmed, darted to Miss Marple as she entered, and her voice was barely a whisper. "Miss Marple, you wanted to see me?" "Yes, my dear," Miss Marple said, her tone as soothing as a lullaby. She settled onto a stool, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders. "I thought we might talk about Mr. Varnholt's work. You were his apprentice, after all our great privilege, I'm sure." Clara nodded, her fingers tightening on the sketchbook. "Is a genius. I learned so much from him." Her voice trembled, and she glanced at the statue, its unfinished form looming like a silent accusation. Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her gaze was keen. "You admire him greatly, don't you? It must be difficult, with him gone." She paused, letting the silence invite confession, a technique she had perfected in countless village chats. "I found a note in the studio, Clara. Meet me at the old mill. Midnight." The handwriting looked familiar, much like the sketches in your book. Clara's face paled, and she took a step back, her breath catching a note. "I know anything about it." But her eyes betrayed her, flicking to the workbench where the sketchbook had lain on. Miss Marple rose, moving to the workbench with the deliberate grace of one who knows exactly what she seeks. She lifted Clara's sketchbook, its pages filled with studies of hands, faces, and the very statue before them. The drawings were meticulous, almost too precise for an apprentice still learning her craft. "These are remarkable," Miss Marple said, her voice warm but probing. "You've captured Mr. Varnholt's style perfectly, almost as if you'd finished his work yourself." Clara's hands twisted together, her knuckles white. I practiced a lot. He taught me to mimic his lines. It's not wrong, is it?" Her voice was defensive, but a tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek. "Not wrong, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, closing the sketchbook, "but imitation can be tempting. Did you write that note, Clara, to meet Mr. Varnholt at the mill?" The girl's shoulders slumped, and she sank onto a stool, her resolve crumbling like dry clay. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I wrote it. I wanted to show him my sketches, my own designs. I thought, if he saw them, he'd let me work on the statue with him. He was always so busy, never had time for me." She wiped her eyes, her words spilling faster now. "I left the note on his workbench, asking him to meet me at the mill at midnight. I went there, waited, hours, but he never came. I swear, Miss Marple, that's all I know." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet understanding, though her mind was racing. Clara's confession confirmed the note's origin, but the girl's distress seemed genuine, her ambition tinged with devotion rather than malice. Yet, the precision of her sketches suggested a talent that might have chafed under Varnholt's shadow. Miss Marple recalled a young seamstress in St. Mary Mead who had copied her mistress's designs, hoping to claim credit, only to be undone by her own guilt. "And you told no one else about this meeting?" she asked, her tone still gentle. Clara shook her head. "No one. I didn't want anyone to know I was pushing myself forward." Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands. Miss Marple patted her shoulder, her touch light but reassuring. There, my dear. Secrets have a way of weighing us down. You've done well to tell me." She paused, her eyes drifting to the statue's base, where the faint scratch she had noticed earlier seemed more pronounced in the morning light. "Did you ever work on this statue, Clara? Even a small part?" Clara looked up, startled. "No. I wouldn't dare. That's his work, his masterpiece. I only sketched it to learn." But her eyes flickered to the base, and Miss Marple noted the fleeting guilt in her expression. As she left the studio, Miss Marple's mind was a whirl of connections. Clara's note had lured Varnholt to the mill, but his absence there suggested someone else had intercepted him or used the note to their advantage. The girl's talent, so evident in her sketches, hinted at an ambition that might have made her a pawn in a larger scheme. Miss Marple thought of the red clay on the chisel, the cufflink marked D, and the whispered gossip about Drayton's muddy boots. Clara's secret was a piece of the puzzle, but the picture was far from complete. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sipped tea, her knitting needles clicking as she pondered. Clara's devotion to Varnholt was clear, but ambition could twist even the purest motives. She recalled a village girl who had sabotaged a rival's garden, driven by a desire to shine. Clara's sketches, so close to Varnholt's style, suggested a talent eager to emerge, perhaps too eager. As the afternoon light faded, Miss Marple resolved to follow the trail of the red clay, certain it would lead her closer to the truth hidden in the shadows of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 9. The dealer's game. The soft glow of lamplight bathed Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting a warm circle around her armchair as she sat with a tray of tea and biscuits, her knitting needles idle for once. The village of St. Mary Mead was hushed under the evening sky, but her mind was far from quiet. turning over the threads of Varnholt's disappearance like a weaver at her loom. The red clay on the chisel, the cufflink marked D, and Clara's tearful confession about the midnight note had sharpened her focus on Mr. Felix Drayton, the art dealer whose charms seemed as carefully crafted as the sculptures he sold. His invitation to tea at the Rose and Crown, delivered that morning with a flourish of his usual polish, had been too opportune to decline. Miss Marple sensed that Drayton, like a skilled player in a game of whist, was laying his cards carefully, but she was no stranger to such games. The inn's private parlour was a cosy contrast to the bustling taproom, its walls lined with faded prints of hunting scenes and its tables set with a silver teapot that gleamed under the chandelier. Drayton rose as Miss Marple entered, his silk cravat as impeccable as ever, his smile a blend of warmth and calculation. "Miss Marple, you honour me," he said, pulling out a chair with a gallant gesture. "I thought a quiet chat might put some of these wild village rumours to rest." Miss Marple settled into the chair, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, her eyes bright with the deceptive mildness that had disarmed many a suspect. "You're most kind, Mr. Drayton," she said, her voice soft as a summer breeze. "Rumours do have a way of muddying the truth, don't they? Like red clay on a pair of boots." She poured tea with deliberate care, watching as his smile faltered. Just for an instant, Drayton recovered quickly, his laugh light but a shade too forced. "Red clay? Oh, you've heard about my hiking misadventure? A whim, I'm afraid. Hills called to me last week. Not my usual haunt, I confess." He sipped his tea, his fingers steady, but Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his eyes flicked to the door as if expecting an interruption. "Danbury is a fair distance," she remarked, her tone conversational, "and yet so close to the old mill where poor Mr. Varnholt was meant to meet someone at midnight. You must have been in London, though, as you told Inspector Craddock." Drayton's smile held, but his eyes were wary. "Indeed, Miss Marple. The 10:15 train, as I said. Business keeps me tethered to the city." He leaned back, crossing one leg over the other, the picture of ease. "But I'm curious why this interest in clay and mills. Surely you don't think I had anything to do with Varnholt's disappearance?" Miss Marple sipped her tea, her gaze steady. "Oh, I think very little, Mr. Drayton. I only observe. For instance, that crate in your gallery, Varnholt Originals, it said. Fresh wood, not weathered like those in his studio. New works from a missing man are unusual, don't you agree?" His hand paused, the teacup halfway to his lips. For a moment the parlour's warmth seemed to chill, and Miss Marple felt the weight of his scrutiny, like a chess player assessing an opponent's move. "You have sharp eyes, Miss Marple," he said at last, his voice smooth but laced with caution. "The crate, a shipment from a collector, as I mentioned. Varnholt's work is always in demand, missing or not. The market thrives on scarcity." "You know, scarcity," Miss Marple repeated, her tone musing. "Like a tragedy that makes an artist's work more valuable. I recall a St. Mary Mead jeweller who once lost a rare gem, only to sell it later at a premium. The market, as you say, loves a story." Her smile was gentle, but her words were a needle, probing for a reaction. Drayton's laugh was a touch too loud. "A charming tale, but I assure you, my business is above board. Varnholt's disappearance is a tragedy, not a strategy." He set his cup down, his fingers brushing the saucer with a faint tremor. "If you'll excuse my bluntness, Miss Marple, you seem to see suspicion everywhere." Not everywhere, she said, folding her hands in her lap. Only where there are shadows, like a cufflink left at the old mill, marked with a D. Such a small thing, easily lost, but so telling. She watched him closely, her eyes as keen as a hawk's. Drayton's face remained composed, but his fingers gripped the armrest, the knuckles whitening for a fleeting moment. A cufflink. Anyone could lose such a trifle. I'm not the only D in the county, Miss Marple. His tone was light, but his eyes held a glint of steel, and she knew she had struck a nerve. The conversation turned to lighter matters, village fates. The weather, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere, piecing together the dealer's game. The red clay on his boots, the cufflink, the fresh cradle pointed to a man whose charm concealed a deeper purpose. She recalled a St. Mary Mead swindler who had forged deeds with a smile, his confidence disarming until the truth unravelled. Drayton's gallery, she suspected, was a front for something more sinister, perhaps tied to Varnholt's absence. As she rose to leave, thanking him for the tea, Drayton's smile returned, but it was strained, like a mask slipping. Do visit the gallery again, Miss Marple, he said, escorting her to the door. And let's hope poor Varnholt turns up soon. I'm sure he will, she replied, her voice serene. Truth has a way of surfacing, like a stone in a stream. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting resumed but her thoughts racing. She rang Mrs. Price at the post office, whose gossip was as reliable as the village clock. Mr. Drayton's shipments, Miss Marple asked. Any recent ones from Danbury, perhaps? Mrs. Price's voice was eager. Oh yes, Miss Marple. A crate came for him 2 days ago, from a Danbury address. Heavy it was, and he collected it himself, looking right flustered. Miss Marple thanked her, her eyes gleaming. A crate from Danbury, red clay, a cufflink. The dealer's game was coming into focus, and she suspected Varnholt was its unwilling pawn. As the fire crackled, she resolved to press further, certain that the next move would reveal the heart of the mystery. Chapter 10. The Critic's Parcel. The village of St. Mary Mead awoke to a morning draped in a fine mist, the kind that softened the edges of the thatched cottages and lent an air of secrecy to the lanes. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her breakfast table with a pot of Earl Grey and a slice of toast, gazed out at the damp garden, her thoughts as sharp as the scissors beside her knitting basket. The clues she had gathered, the red clay on the chisel, the cufflink marked D, Clara's tearful confession, and Drayton's strained charm were weaving a pattern, but it was Miss Evelyn Trent, the sharp-tongued critic, who now occupied her mind. The heavy parcel from London, mentioned by Mrs. Price, had piqued Miss Marple's curiosity, and she sensed it held a key to the mystery of Varnholt's disappearance. Determined to probe further, Miss Marple persuaded Inspector Craddock to search Miss Trent's lodgings at the Rose and Crown. Craddock, though initially sceptical of her hunches, had come to trust her instincts, honed by years of unravelling village intrigues. Very well, Miss Marple, he said over the telephone, his voice tinged with resignation, but we'll need something concrete. I can't just barge in on a whim. A parcel from an art supply shop, delivered the day Varnholt vanished. Is hardly a whim, Miss Marple replied, her tone mild but firm. It may contain nothing, Inspector, but then again, it may contain everything. By mid-morning, Miss Marple stood outside the inn, her umbrella shielding her from the drizzle as Craddock and Constable Harris approached Miss Trent's room. The critic, summoned from her writing desk, greeted them with a scowl, her cigarette holder clutched like a weapon. This is outrageous, she snapped. her black dress as severe as her expression. "What possible reason do you have to invade my privacy?" Craddock, unflappable, held up a warrant. "Routine inquiries, Miss Trent. We're following all leads regarding Mr. Varnholt's disappearance. Now, if you'll show us that parcel from London." Miss Trent's lips tightened, but she led them to a small trunk in the corner of her room, its lid already ajar, as if she'd anticipated scrutiny. Inside, wrapped in brown paper, were several plaster casts, small replicas of Varnholt's sculptures, their surfaces smooth but unmistakably his style. Miss Marple, standing quietly by the door, noted the precision of the casts, down to the delicate curves of a nymph's arm and the texture of a satyr's horn. "Research materials," Miss Trent said brusquely, her voice cutting through the room's silence. "I study an artist's technique to critique it properly. These are reference pieces, nothing more." Her eyes met Craddock's with a challenge, but Miss Marple caught the faint tremor in her hand as she gestured to the casts. Craddock examined one, a miniature of the dancer Miss Marple had seen in Drayton's gallery. "These are remarkably detailed," he said, his tone neutral. "From London, you say?" "An art supply firm," Miss Trent replied, her voice steady but her posture rigid. "I ordered them weeks ago for my work. Surely you don't think I'd involve myself in Varnholt's affairs beyond my reviews?" Miss Marple stepped forward, her umbrella folded neatly under her arm. "Of course not, Miss Trent," she said, her voice as gentle as a lullaby. "But it's curious, isn't it, how these casts resemble pieces in Mr. Drayton's gallery? Almost as if they were made from the same molds." She paused, her eyes meeting the critics', which flickered with unease, and delivered so conveniently on the day Mr. Varnholt vanished. Miss Trent's cigarette holder tapped sharply against the trunk. "A coincidence," she said, her tone icy. "I'm a critic, Miss Marple, not a conspirator. If you're implying some connection with that dealer, you're mistaken." Craddock, sensing the tension, pressed further. "We'll need the name of that supplier, Miss Trent, and any correspondence related to the order." Miss Trent hesitated, then produced a receipt from a drawer, her movements reluctant. The receipt, from a London firm known for casting supplies, confirmed the delivery date but offered little else. Miss Marple, however, noted the faint smudge of red clay on the paper's edge, a detail Miss Trent seemed unaware of. "Thank you," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "You've been most helpful." As they left the inn, Craddock muttered, "Those casts could be innocent, but they're too perfect for mere study. And that receipt, why keep it so handy?" Unless she expected questions. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The casts, the clay, the timing all pointed to a link between Miss Trent and Drayton. She recalled a St. Mary Mead forger who had used plaster molds to replicate rare coins, passing them off as originals until a single flaw betrayed him. A critic and a dealer, she mused, working together could control an artist's market estimate. If that artist were unavailable. Later, at the village post office, Miss Marple confirmed with Mrs. Price that Drayton had received a similar parcel from the same London firm, delivered a day after Miss Trent's. Heavy it was, Mrs. Price said, her eyes gleaming with gossip, and he was in a right hurry to collect it, not his usual charming self. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting needles clicking as she pieced together the puzzle. The casts suggested a scheme to replicate Varnholt's work, perhaps to flood the market with forgeries. Miss Trent's venom, she suspected, was not just professional disdain but a mask for complicity. her critiques designed to depress Varnholt's value while Drayton prepared to profit from new works. The red clay linked them both to the mill, where Varnholt might still be held, his talent exploited in secret. As the village clock chimed, Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her eyes bright with resolve. The critic's parcel had revealed a partnership, and the next step would be to trap the players in their own game. Chapter 11. The trap. The evening air in St. Mary Mead carried a crisp edge, the kind that heralded the approach of autumn as Miss Jane Marple sat in her cottage, her knitting needles moving with a rhythm that belied the intensity of her thoughts. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the walls, but her mind was far from the cosy parlour, weaving together the clues that had emerged in the mystery of Peter Varnholt's disappearance. The red clay-stained chisel, the cufflink marked D, Clara's midnight note, the fresh crate in Drayton's gallery, and the plaster casts in Miss Trent's truncle pointed to a scheme orchestrated by Felix Drayton, with Evelyn Trent as a likely accomplice. Yet suspicion was not proof, and Miss Marple knew that to unravel the truth, she must lay a trap as cunning as the dealer's game. She had devised her plan with care, drawing on a memory of a St. Mary Mead poacher who had been caught after a false rumour lured him to a guarded barn. The key, she decided, was the unfinished statue in Varnholt's studio, a masterpiece that Drayton, greedy for profit, would not resist. Over tea at the village shop, she let slip a carefully crafted tidbit to Mrs. Price, whose tongue was as swift as the river. "They say," Miss Marple murmured, her voice low but clear, "that Varnholt hid a signature in the statue's base, a mark that proves its authenticity. Only he knew where to look." Mrs. Price's eyes widened, and Miss Marple knew that rumour would spread like wildfire, reaching Drayton's ears by nightfall. She then telephoned Inspector Craddock, her tone as calm as if she were discussing the weather. "Inspector, I believe someone may try to tamper with the statue tonight. A hidden signature, you see, could ruin a forger's plans. Might you station men near the studio?" Craddock, though accustomed to her cryptic suggestions, sighed. "A signature, Miss Marple? You're certain this isn't another of your intuitions?" "Not intuition, Inspector," she replied, her voice gentle but firm. "Observation. The statue is the heart of this mystery, and someone will want to ensure it holds no secrets." By dusk, the studio was under quiet watch, with Constable Harris and 2 officers concealed in the shadows of the surrounding trees. Miss Marple, though urged to stay home, insisted on being nearby, seated in a discreet corner of the vicarage garden, a short distance from the barn. Her shawl was wrapped tightly against the evening chill, and her eyes, sharp as ever, scanned the darkened path leading to the studio. At 10:30, a figure emerged from the mist, moving with the cautious grace of a cat. Miss Marple's breath caught as she recognized the silhouette Felix Drayton, his usual polish replaced by a dark coat and a hurried gait. He carried a small satchel, its contents clinking faintly as he approached the studio door. The lock, left unsecured at Miss Marple's suggestion, yielded easily, and he slipped inside. Constable Harris, alerted by a prearranged signal, crept closer, his lantern dimmed. Miss Marple watched as a faint light flickered within the studio, likely a torch in Drayton's hand. She imagined him at the statue's base, searching for the non-existent signature, his greed blinding him to the trap. Minutes passed, tense and silent, until a sudden scuffle broke the stillness. Voice, sharp with panic, echoed as he bolted from the studio, only to be met by Craddock's men, their lanterns flaring to life. "Stop where you are, Mr. Drayton." Craddock's voice rang out, authoritative and unyielding. Drayton froze, his satchel dropping to the ground with a thud. Miss Marple rose, moving closer with surprising agility, her eyes fixed on the dealer. As he was restrained in the studio, the torchlight revealed Drayton's handiworker, chisel poised to deface the statue's base, where he had begun to chip away at the marble. "Looking for something, Mr. Drayton?" Craddock asked, his tone dry as he examined the tool. Drayton's charm had vanished, replaced by a sullen glare. "This proves nothing," he muttered. "I was inspecting the statue for authenticity." Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice soft but piercing. "Authenticity is a fine thing, Mr. Drayton, but forgery is a dangerous game. That chisel, I suspect, matches the one from the mill, stained with red clay, and your cufflink's such a careless thing to leave behind." Craddock, sensing the moment, ordered a search of Drayton's car, parked discreetly down the lane. Inside, they found a sight that stilled the night air. Peter Van Holt, bound and gagged but alive, his face pale but defiant. He was cramped in the boot, surrounded by sketches and half-finished casts, evidence of his forced labour. "Peter," Miss Marple exclaimed softly, her relief tempered by the gravity of the discovery, as the officers freed him. Voice rasped, "Drayton. He wanted more sculptures. Kept me in a cottage near Danbury, forced me to carve." Craddock's face hardened as he turned to Drayton. "You've some explaining to do, sir," Miss Marple, her eyes gleaming, murmured. "A dealer's greed, Inspector, can outshine even the brightest charm." She recalled a St. Mary Mead merchant who had hoarded stolen goods, caught when his own haste betrayed him. Drayton's trap, she knew, had been sprung by his own ambition. As the officers led Drayton away, Miss Marple lingered by the statue, its half-carved form a silent witness to the night's revelations. The mystery was nearly solved, but one thread remained Miss Trent's role in the scheme. With Van Holt safe, Miss Marple resolved to tie up the final knot in the village hall, where the truth would be laid bare. Chapter 12. The truth unveiled, the village hall of St. Mary Mead was abuzz with anticipation, its wooden beams echoing with the murmurs of gathered villagers. The long table, usually laden with tea-urns and scones for parish meetings, now served as a stage for resolution, its surface cluttered with Inspector Craddock's notebooks and a single telling chisel stained with red clay. Miss Jane Marple sat unobtrusively at the side, her shawl neatly folded, her knitting needles silent in their bag. Her eyes, bright and unyielding, surveyed the room where the suspects Clara Henshaw, Sir Reginald Poole, Miss Evelyn Trent, and the newly apprehended Felix Drayton sat, under the watchful gaze of Constable Harris. Peter Van Holt, pale but resolute, stood near Craddock, his presence a living testament to the trap that had freed him the previous night. The hall's windows admitted a pale morning light, casting long shadows across the faces of the assembled. Craddock, his square jaw set, addressed the crowd with the authority of a man determined to close the case. "We are here to resolve the matter of Mr. Van Holt's disappearance," he began, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "Thanks to certain insights," he glanced at Miss Marple, who inclined her head slightly, "we have uncovered a scheme that endangered a man's life and his art." Miss Marple, her hands folded in her lap, let her gaze drift to each suspect in turn. Clara, her eyes red but steady, clutched her sketchbook like a shield. Sir Reginald, his moustache bristling, sat with the indignation of a man unused to scrutiny. Miss Trent, her cigarette holder absent, maintained a rigid composure, though her fingers betrayed a faint tremor. Drayton, handcuffed and sullen, stared. At the floor, his charm extinguished like a snuffed candle. Craddock gestured to Van Holt. "Mr. Van Holt, please tell us what happened." The sculptor's voice was hoarse but clear, his Dutch accent softened by fatigue. "Drayton came to my studio that night. I was working late, as always. He said he had a buyer, urgent, and asked me to meet him at the old mill. I went, expecting a discussion, but," he faltered, his hands clenching, "he ambushed me, bound me, and took me to a cottage near Danbury. He forced me to carve small pieces, copies of my work. He said the market wanted more, and my disappearance would make them priceless." A gasp rippled through the crowd, and Miss Marple's eyes flickered to Drayton, whose jaw tightened, but who offered no denial. She spoke, her voice soft but piercing. "A clever plan, Mr. Drayton. A missing artist creates a legend, and legends sell for a fortune. But you needed help, didn't you? Someone to ensure the forgeries passed scrutiny." Miss Trent's head snapped up, her eyes flashing. "If you're implying I was involved, Miss Marple, you're gravely mistaken. I'm a critic, not a criminal." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, almost pitying. "A critic's pen can shape a market, Miss Trent. Your reviews, so harsh on Mr. Van Holt, drove down his value, making it easier to flood the market with forgeries. And those plaster casts in your trunk perfect replicas of his work, were they truly for research?" She paused, letting the question hang. "Or were they moulds for Drayton's scheme, delivered from London to aid his forgeries?" The crowd murmured, and Miss Trent's composure cracked, her voice rising. "This is absurd. I ordered those casts to study his technique, nothing more." Craddock held up the receipt from Miss Trent's room, its edge smudged with red clay. "This came from the same supplier as Drayton's crates, Miss Trent. And we found correspondence in your desk, a letter from Drayton promising a share of the profits if you kept Van Holt's reputation in check. Care to explain?" Miss Trent's face paled, her hands gripping the table. I was only protecting my reputation as a critic. Drayton suggested a collaboration, yes, but I didn't know he'd kidnap anyone." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her voice remained steady. "You knew enough, Miss Trent. Your venom was not just professional, it was profitable. A critic and a dealer, working together, could control an artist's legacy, especially if that artist were silenced." She turned to Clara, whose tears had begun anew. "And you, my dear, played a smaller part, but a part nonetheless. Your note lured Mr. Van Holt to the mill, though I believe you meant no harm. Your ambition to prove yourself led you to write it, but someone else, Drayton, saw it and used it to his advantage." Clara nodded, her voice a whisper. "I only wanted him to see my sketches. I didn't know." Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Sir Reginald, who blustered, "I had no part in this. My only crime was funding that stubborn fool's work." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "Your pride and debts made you a distraction, Sir Reginald, but not a conspirator. Your anger at Van Holt's defiance was real, but it was Drayton who acted." Craddock stepped forward, his voice firm. "Felix Drayton, you're under arrest for kidnapping and fraud. Miss Trent, you'll face charges as an accessory. We have evidence, enough casts, letters, and Mr. Van Holt's testimony." As Drayton was led away, his defiance crumbled, and Miss Trent followed, her head bowed. The crowd erupted in whispers, but Miss Marple rose, her work done. She approached Van Holt, who stood by the statue's sketches, his eyes weary but grateful. "Miss Marple," he said, "I owe you my freedom. She smiled, patting his arm. "You owe me nothing, Mr. Van Holt. Finish your statuette's a masterpiece waiting to be born." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting resumed, the needles clicking in time with her thoughts. She thought of a St. Mary Mead swindler, caught by his own greed, and reflected on the timeless truth of human nature. "Greed and ambition," she murmured, "are the oldest motives of all." As the village settled into its quiet rhythm, she knew the truth had been unveiled, and St. Mary Mead could rest at least until the next mystery stirred its sleepy lanes.